We are in Jonah today. Um, Up till now, we've been hitting some rather unfamiliar prophets, Amos and Joel and Obadiah. These are prophets that don't get a lot of play in Vacation Bible School or even in a lot of sermon series. And unless they're doing a series like this one where they're specifically going through it, how often do you hear a sermon that even references the book of Obadiah, let alone uses it as the primary text? I think pretty rarely. Um, so Jonah, on the other hand, gets a lot of play. But it is an unusual book. Even in our study of the prophets, it's unusual. It may vie for the most unusual book in the Bible, actually. First off, we don't even know who the author is. If it's Jonah, as would be the traditional approach, it's got his name on it. Obviously, he's the author, right? But if it's Jonah who wrote it, it's oddly third person. Because except for chapter 2, which is like the prayer of Jonah, Jonah is described in third person throughout the whole rest of the book. So Jonah is a character in the story, does not seem to be the narrator of the story. He's telling, this is a story about Jonah, and yes, it could be by Jonah. It's not unheard of for biblical authors to refer to themselves in the third person, but pretty rare to do it through the whole book. Furthermore, we don't even know to whom the book was written exactly, and the dating of the book is highly instructive, or the relationship between when the book was written and to whom it was written is very close. If this was written by Jonah or in the days of Jonah, then it was probably to the northern tribes, because Jonah was a prophet to the north. He was born in the north. His hometown is in the north, pretty far north, actually. And we know that he was a prophet to Jeroboam II, because he was prophesying to him about reclaiming the different territories, as recorded in 2 Kings. He's described as going north here in the book of Jonah himself. But it doesn't, I don't know, it doesn't say specifically who the author is. And the southern tribes, if it was written later, then maybe it was written for the southern tribes. There's speculation, and here getting to the dating of it. We don't know whether this was written in Jonah's lifetime, or at a later time. There are some scholars who think it might have been as late as the post-exilic period, when somebody wrote down this narrative about Jonah. If it was that late, then obviously the northern tribes don't exist anymore, and the audience would have to be the southern tribes, or the remnant left after the exile. So the audience, we don't know exactly, and we don't know the date, and we're not even sure exactly why the book was written. So the occasion that spurred the writing of this book is unclear as well. The only thing that we can speculate about why the book is written is the theme of the book. The theme of the book seems to be pushing against an attitude of Jewish favor that creates an us versus them mentality, where all the Gentile nations are bad and the Jewish people are all good. And this us versus them mentality seems to be addressed and critiqued by the book of Jonah. So the idea is that maybe the book was written specifically to push back against this us versus them mentality. But we don't know exactly what moment in history exactly spurred it. Is obviously the only thing we can do is say it's wasn't written any earlier than the reign of Jeroboam II, because that's the one thing we can pin down and say, well, these events transpired sometime around then. So that's when the events transpired, but we don't know exactly when the book was written about those events. So with all that in mind, we'll look at Jonah. Now, Jonah is unusual, not only because of all of this uncertainty about it, and it's unusual in the book of the prophets because it's the only one of the minor prophets that is more a story than it is a sermon. As we've seen with Joel and Amos and Obadiah, those are sermons or series of sermons. In the case of Amos, where it was a longer book, we have sermons with very little narrative. There's a little bit in Amos where we talk about the conflict between him and Amaziah, the priest at Bethel, and there's a little bit of narrative there about what's going on. But other than that, it's mostly sermon material, and we would say the same thing is true of Obadiah and Joel, but not in Jonah. We don't really have sermon material, we have a story, and so that makes it unusual. Not only that, but Jonah himself is unusual as a prophet. Jonah may be the most unlikable prophet of anybody in the Bible. He is not really the hero of the story. He is the main, I guess we call him protagonist, technically, because his choices drive the storyline, but he's not a hero. He is an anti-hero. Classic literary anti-hero who we don't want to root for because he makes bad choices all the way along. So he is this anti-hero. In fact, if we were to analyze Jonah as a literary work, it would clearly fall into a literary style called satire, because it is a backwards look at everything. All the people we meet in the book of Jonah, everybody has a better relationship with God than Jonah. Jonah the prophet has the worst relationship with God than anybody else in the story, at least after we meet them. So Jonah the prophet is the worst one, and all the other people are good. And the Gentile nations, which we would expect to be the bad guys, are actually the ones who respond favorably to God's word. So everything's backwards in the book of Jonah. So we're going to be looking at this book for a couple of weeks. And this week, we're going to focus on the first chapter. I did want to orient us a little bit geographically. I said that Jonah was a northern prophet, a prophet to the north, and he comes from the furthest north that I'm aware of any of the prophets. This is a map of northern tribes of Israel, and Gath Hepher, which is mentioned as Jonah's hometown, is way up north in Zebulun, not far south of the Sea of Galilee. So he's up there in the northern part, far north of even Samaria. We know Gath Hepher was his hometown. We know that he was a prophet in Samaria proper because he did prophesy to Jeroboam II about his recovered territory. So we can place Jonah in Gath Hepher, and we can place him in Samaria. Those are the two key places mentioned here in the first chapter. Here we'll start with the first 4 verses. The word of Yahweh came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Get up, go to the great city Nineveh, and cry out against her, because their evil has come up before me." All right, and here's where Jonah makes his first mistake. But Jonah set out to flee toward Tarshish from the presence of Yahweh. And he went down to Joppa and found a merchant ship going to Tarshish, and paid her fare and went on board her to go with them toward Tarshish from the presence of Yahweh. And Yahweh hurled a great wind upon the sea, and it was a great storm on the sea, and the merchant ship was in danger of breaking up. So just to give us another geographical orientation, this is a map that was specifically a map of Jonah's travel. We can see him going from Gath Hepher down to Joppa. and then onto the water. Tarshish isn't even on this map because it's too far away to give a good perspective of its location relative to the other items on the map. Tarshish is not a well-attested name from the ancient world, so we have to do a little guessing about where it might be. But the name does sound like some of the place names that were associated with as far away as Spain and France, that part of the world, in this time frame. So that's where people pretty much have come down to think where Tarshish was out near the Atlantic Ocean, on the far edge of the Mediterranean Sea. So he is getting on a ship to go as far away as you can, without going into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean from Israel and Nineveh, or any place he's been told to go. But he doesn't get that far when a storm comes up, and that's where you see the reversal on the map. The path is where people presume the storm would have hit him along this way. We have absolutely no idea. There's no geography described after he gets on the boat, until he gets back on land. But that's where scholars may think that, because I suppose there are severe storms in that area on occasion. But he was hit with a storm there. Now here's where things, I think, get interesting, and where we're going to dive down into it is this interaction between the sailors and Jonah. In verse 5, it says, "The mariners were afraid. They each cried out to his God, and they threw the contents that were in the merchant ship into the sea to lighten it for them. And meanwhile, Jonah went down into the hold of the vessel and lay down and fell asleep." Yeah, the implication there in the NIV is that he went to sleep before the storm started. That he was already in the hold, had already gone there, and that's kind of what the meanwhile is meant to imply here, I think, is that this was something that had happened concurrently with or possibly before the storm started. But that's not in the Hebrew. The Hebrew doesn't suggest at all that this was something that happened before the events that we just read about. That Jonah had already gone down into the hold and fallen asleep while the sea was calm or relatively calm, and then the storm came. No, it suggests two responses to the storm. The response of the sailors was to cry out to their gods. The response of Jonah is to go down and go to sleep.
I think the ESV reads that way, because when I read it, I was reading ahead, and that's how I interpreted it. I didn't, because it's the way it sets it up, at least in the ESV, is like there's what the mariners are doing, crying out to their gods, throwing stuff over the ship. And they're like, but Jonah decided to be asleep in the innermost part of the ship. Like, that seems like pretty intentional to me. Like, I'm going to go to the safest spot, and I'm just going to like ostrich over here.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly what the Hebrew writer wants us to think about what Jonah's doing. I think you're exactly right. What are the rest of the mariners doing? They're trying to survive the storm. They're making every effort to do so in two ways. So they're taking the physical actions of lightening the ship and the spiritual actions of trying to reach out spiritually to their gods for help. Jonah doesn't do any of that. Jonah doesn't seem to want to help. I think it is fair to say that Jonah doesn't care if he dies. And he doesn't seem to care whether anybody else on the ship dies either. He is resigned to, he might even know that this storm is the wrath of God coming on him for fleeing from his presence. He is a prophet of God, after all. He has spoken on God's behalf to Jeroboam before. He knows God and about him. So he knows that fleeing from God can result in the wrath of God. So he may know that, but he does not seem to want to do anything but curl up. I like the way you put that, Caitlin. Ostrich ostrich himself with his head in the sand, and just go to sleep, as if I'm just going to go to sleep and go down with the ship. Well, he's not going to get off that easy. In verses 6 and 7, the captain of the ship approached him and said to him, "Why are you sound asleep? Get up, call on your God. Perhaps your God will take notice of us and we won't perish." And then they said to one another, "Come, let's cast lots, so we may know on whose account this disaster has come upon us." And they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Now, casting lots is one way that has been used to discover a truth, a random method. When you don't have any other way of knowing what's going on, you introduce this random element and hope that the will of the gods, the spiritual forces, will guide the random choice to the right person. I think there's every reason to think that Jonah is sitting over there while they're casting lots, thinking it's just a pagan tradition to do this casting lots. It's just a random choice. I don't think Jonah expected anything out of this until what happens? The lot lands on him. I think this was God's way of picking out Jonah and of making Jonah know he's not going to get away with it. He's not going to be able to weasel out of this in any way, shape, or form. The guy who's been trying to hide in the hold turns out to be the center of attention, with everybody looking to him to say, what's going on? Because that's what they just start peppering him with questions to try to get to the bottom of this. And notice that they don't directly accuse him of being the cause of the storm, but the lots show that he has something to do with it, so they're peppering him with questions to find out what's going on. And so they said to him in verse 8 through 10, "Please tell us, whoever is responsible for that this disaster has come on us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? From which people are you?" Just trying to figure something out about this passenger. They're probably regretting they ever get on the ship. So he said to them, "I am a Hebrew. I fear Yahweh, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." And then the men were greatly afraid, and they said to him, "What is this thing you've done?" Because they knew that he was fleeing from the presence of Yahweh, because he had told them. I think it's interesting that the timing of that, the way that is narrated, that they're afraid because of what he said. Then they ask him, what is it you've done? Because he had already told them that he had been running from the presence of Yahweh. But it comes down to the fact that he at least admits that he was trying to run away from Yahweh. But this is after he's already stated that he's running away from the God who made the sea and the dry land. There is no way to get away from that God. They were accustomed to thinking about their gods as regional, as my God is the God of Greece, or my God is the God of the Ammonites, or my God is the God of this area or that. Fleeing from their God by going to some other God's territory wouldn't have been an unusual concept for them, to get away from the sphere of influence of one divine being by going somewhere else. So fleeing from that wouldn't have been too big. But Jonah says he's trying to flee from the God who made the land and the sea. There's no other place to be except on the land or on the sea. And his God, he says, made it all. Now, I think Jonah does, though, in this commentary, the only good things for this entire chapter that Jonah does. The only good things are, first, he gives glory to Yahweh. He acknowledges that he does fear Yahweh and that he is the God of heaven who made the sea and the dry land. He acknowledges him as the creator and as of the one true God. And the other thing he does, which I think is a good thing, is that he admits his own failure to stay loyal to God. So he is, or we might call today, in today's jargon, he's authentic. He is confessing the truth about his failure to remain loyal to the God of heaven in trying to run away from him. So he acknowledges God's sovereignty and God's power, and he admits his own failure to live up to that loyalty that God deserves. These are the only two things I think Jonah is praiseworthy of, at least in this chapter. So, since Jonah has admitted to being the problem, the sailors say, okay, so they said to him, what shall we do to you so that the sea may quiet down for us? Because the sea was growing more and more tempestuous. And he said to them, pick me up and hurl me into the sea so that the sea may quiet down for you. Because I know that on account of me, this great storm has come upon you all. But the men rowed hard to bring the ship back to dry land, but they could not do so because the sea was growing more and more tempestuous around them, against them.
Like, I read this the first time thinking like, oh, like that was a great moment for Jonah to like actually show some like accountability and maybe like I was reading it the first time as like an act of faith. Like, I'm gonna do the right thing, jump overboard. I don't know what's gonna happen to me, but that's what I need to do. But now that we're like reading this more slowly, I almost read it as like, you kind of notice that the guys, you know, running the ship are showing him more consideration than he's ever shown them. Like, he knows why the storm's following them.
Right.
You're genuinely afraid of his God too, after he kind of unpacks that for them. And they still try to be like, okay, well, we'll try to row. Maybe we can row past it. We don't want to throw you overboard. But he never showed them like that kind of consideration for a second. Like, I don't know if I'm being clear, but you know what I mean?
Oh, no, I totally agree.
Yeah, I think you're right.
That's why I say the Gentiles, who are normally the bad guys, are shown in Jonah to be more faithful, more considerate, more compassionate than Jonah ever is. You're right, Caitlin. So let's see. So they cried out to Yahweh and said, "Oh Yahweh." So now they're actually praying to Yahweh by name. "Please do not let us perish because of this man's life, and do not make us guilty of innocent blood, because you, O Yahweh, did what you wanted." And they picked Jonah up and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. So the men feared Yahweh greatly, and they offered to sacrifice to Yahweh and made vows. So ultimately, the storm's just getting worse. As the storm gets worse and worse, they just realize they have no choice but to do what Jonah has suggested. It's the only solution that's been offered. Jonah admits to being the problem, and yet before they throw him overboard, they pray. Something Jonah has yet to do again, but the sailors pray again, crying out to Yahweh, don't hold us accountable for throwing him overboard. He suggested it, and he says, this is what you want, Yahweh. We don't know, but we're just going to do this. Please don't hold us accountable. So as far as these sailors know, they killed Jonah by throwing him overboard. But the storm stops when they do that. So this is in itself an affirmation that all that Jonah had said is true. He was the problem. His God was creating the storm. And what he said about that God, that he was the God of heaven, the creator of the sea and the dry land, was true. And what do they do after that? They make sacrifices to Yahweh, and they make vows. Now, you do not make vows to a God that is not your own God. You make vows to the God that you are faithful to, not to somebody else's God, only to your own. You might participate in a sacrifice that is to some other God than the one you normally follow. You could at least be near it or a part of the process. But you're not going to make vows to a God that's not your own. And so when these sailors, and apparently they get to shore at their first opportunity, I mean, who wouldn't? But they get to shore at their first opportunity and they make sacrifices. They initiate sacrifices to Yahweh and make vows to him. So they are claiming loyalty to Yahweh from that point forward because of what happens with Jonah. So Jonah, despite himself, converts an entire shipload of Gentiles to worshiping Yahweh. What do we see that Jonah did right? What do we see that the sailors did right? Well, Jonah did at least two things right in this first chapter, and I highlighted them that he did. He affirmed that Yahweh was worthy of complete loyalty. That was the first and probably most important thing that Jonah did right. Yahweh is the one true God, the creator God, God of the sea and the dry land. And he did admit his own fault, that he had not been loyal to Yahweh. When it comes to giving our testimony, just to tie it into us today, I think these are also the most important two things that we need to do. If we're trying to reach out to people around us, is first we need to affirm that Yahweh, our God, the God of the Bible, is the one true God, the creator of all things, and the one who deserves our loyalty absolutely. When it comes to a Christian testimony, we show that he deserves our loyalty absolutely because of what he did through Christ. He sent his own son. His son sacrificed himself for our sin. He deserves our loyalty absolutely. But secondly, Jonah is willing to admit that he had not been loyal to Yahweh. And I think that willingness on our part, that we haven't always been loyal, is also something that can actually positively influence our testimony. When we admit to our own weakness, it can be an advantage. If we pretend like we're the perfect people, then the people we're trying to testify to are not going to be as receptive as if we admit that we're not perfect people, that we do have failings and faults, and we don't keep our loyalty to Yahweh perfectly. And Jonah didn't have this option, but we as Christians can say, I admit that I have not followed Christ perfectly, but he forgives me. Jesus actually paid the price for my failings. Jesus was the one who got thrown overboard, in other words. Jesus took the price. The penalty for Jonah for failing to follow God, in that case, was getting thrown overboard the ship. From the perspective of those sailors, that was a death sentence. Jesus has taken that sentence for us. And so we have that, and that just magnifies the fact that Yahweh deserves our loyalty even more, because he sent his son to take that for us. The sailors, they responded to that positively. They cried out to Yahweh for forgiveness. Even before they threw him overboard, they were still concerned with Yahweh's forgiveness. They feared Yahweh greatly. So this wasn't just actions. The writer wants us to understand, the writer of the book of Jonah, that this was not a superficial thing. They just did the little thing they needed to do just to perform a ritual or to do an act that would get them out of trouble. They genuinely feared Yahweh. They were respectful of him in their hearts, and they feared him in their hearts. This was not just a superficial act. And then they sought fellowship with Yahweh through sacrifice. The word that's used for the sacrifice of those sailors, what they did, is the same word that's used for a fellowship offering where a meal is shared between the participants. And the implication is that God is a participant in the meal as well, because some of the sacrifice would go to him on the altar, and what didn't get burned up on the altar, which was his portion, would be shared as a meal amongst the rest of the people there. So it was as if God was a participant in the meal, because we give him his part on the altar and we share the rest as a meal together. So this sacrifice was also an opportunity to share fellowship with Yahweh. So they're not just afraid of him, but they want to be near him. And the sacrifice implies this nearness, intimacy with Yahweh through sharing a fellowship meal with him in the sacrifice. And then finally, they committed themselves to Yahweh through vows. So this was a long-term act. It wasn't just getting out of it. It wasn't like, oh, if you save me, Yahweh, I'll give you $100 or whatever. I'll be faithful for a little while if you'll just save me from this circumstance. They had already survived the storm. They were already on dry land, and yet they were making vows to commit themselves long-term to Yahweh. So they made a long-term commitment to him.